Krystal, what are you taking a look at?
Well, guys, we've been tracking this. There's a mass hysteria that's sweeping the country right now. A nasty anti-Russian xenophobia primed by decades of Cold War propaganda, years of Russiagate mania, and then whipped into a little frenzy by the media. It's freedom fries with a side of potential nuclear war. And history tells us that the voices we should look for in such times are those who are willing to urge the most unpopular thing in the entire world. That would be restraint. The most scorned, derided, and reviled often end up looking wise and prescient once the madness of the time has passed. And make no mistake, we are in a time of madness. Russian restaurants, even some owned by Ukrainians, are being boycotted, flooded with nasty reviews, bombarded with phone calls, calling them Nazis, and in the worst cases, vandalized. On Tuesday, I showed you thousands of protesters marching in Chicago demanding we close the skies. That's a reference, of course, to enacting a no-fly zone, which would almost certainly lead us to World War III. A new protest at the Guggenheim pushed the same message with a different tactic. Artists gathered on every floor to send airplanes out onto the floor of the famed museum. But the most troubling mania is happening among the people with power. In Washington, we have rushed into a wholesale economic war on Russia with consequences almost no one has stopped to contemplate. Our tools of economic warfare are indiscriminate, they are brutal, and they are unprecedented. It's already easy to forget how quickly our actions and thinking have escalated. Just a few weeks ago, kicking Russia off of the SWIFT bank communication system, that was considered the most extreme potential response to their actions. Now, SWIFT is small potatoes. We've given Russia the full global economic death penalty, including SWIFT removal, the first in history sanctions against a G20 central bank, and now a ban on Russian oil and energy products. Russia, of course, considers these actions to be an act of war and are warning of the price that we will pay from their response. The economic consequences will reverberate around the globe. Oil and wheat prices will continue to climb. And if there is one thing that I know, it's that skyrocketing energy and food prices do not often lead to more global peace and stability. At the same time, it is impossible to wrap your head around just how quickly we have flooded Ukraine with American-made weapons. During the Cold War, there was actually this kind of kabuki theater diplomacy requiring that we at least had some plausible deniability about the flow of our arms into the arsenals of anti-communists. We no longer have any reluctance about being completely brazen here. The New York Times reports that we are rushing our most effective weaponry into the country with record-breaking speed in an effort of such scale it's being compared to the Berlin airlift. 17,000 anti-tank weapons in 6 days. $360 million worth of weapons delivered in 5 days. By comparison, a much smaller package announced back in August that took months to get on the ground. The US and our NATO allies have been messing around with the idea of getting fighter jets. The Ukrainian Sagar was just talking about that. Thank God that latest harebrained scheme failed to accomplish what they wanted here. Someone was sensible enough to realize that the minute a NATO pilot, let alone an American pilot, flies a jet into Ukraine, we have officially entered World War III. It is worth recalling again that arming the Ukrainians against Russian aggression was highly controversial and not so long ago. When Russia invaded Crimea, President Obama resisted the immense pressure to arm Ukrainians, reportedly posing the following questions to his aides. Quote, okay, what happens if we send in equipment? Do we have to send in trainers? What if it ends up in the hands of thugs? What if Putin then escalates? He also reportedly worried that, quote, arming the Ukrainians would encourage the notion that they could actually defeat the far more powerful Russians, and so it would potentially draw a more forceful response from Moscow. Listen, those questions all seem pretty valid, but few have the courage to actually raise them publicly today. We should all also be extremely uncomfortable with how many people are now throwing around the example of our arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, as if that whole thing turned out well for us.
But remember, the Russians invaded Afghanistan back in 1980. And although no country went in, they certainly had a lot of countries supplying arms and advice and even some advisors to those who were recruited to fight Russia. It didn't end well for the Russians. There were other unintended consequences, as we know, but the fact is that a very motivated and then funded and armed insurgency basically drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Obviously, the similarities are not ones that you should bank on, because the terrain, the development in urban areas, et cetera, is so different. But I think that is the model that people are now looking toward. And if there can be sufficient armaments that get in, and they should be able to get in along some of...
Oh, really? Some unintended consequences. Why don't you elaborate a little bit on that, Hill? And to be honest, military aid is just the beginning. We're also providing aid which is not being talked about by politicians or really debated at all. Did you know that a cadre of American lobbyists are influence peddling and giving PR help to Zelensky and the Ukrainian government right now? That means giving favorable stories place, pushing his interest among their powerful friends, using all of their dark arts to skillfully manipulate the American public. Now, again, there's a lot to admire about Zelensky personally, but his interests are not the same as ours. And he, remember, is aggressively calling for the most hawkish possible response. Did you know that we may be leading an active cyber counteroffensive to fight back against Russian attacks on Ukrainian networks, and have almost certainly collaborated to harden those networks in advance? Did you know that we are using our own satellite images and electronic intercepts of Russian military communications to help send warnings and guide Ukrainian military decision-making? And those are just the elements of support that have been publicly reported. Lord only knows what secret programs have been launched with zero awareness and zero debate, but potentially catastrophic consequences. In terms of elected officials, we haven't seen a whole lot of courage. All of these actions have been overwhelmingly supported on a bipartisan basis, with barely even pausing to say, maybe we should talk about this. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has actually been one of those very lonely voices. On arming the Ukrainians, she tweeted, quote, "The consequences of flooding Ukraine with billions of dollars in U.S. weapons, likely not limited to just military-specific equipment, but also including small arms and ammo, are unpredictable and likely disastrous, especially when they are given to paramilitary groups without accountability." She was also prepared to be the sole lone vote against a Russian oil ban. Biden has since decided to institute that oil ban without the help of Congress. But here's what Congresswoman Omar had to say on the matter. She said, "Whether it is politically or morally, we have to think about what this means a year from now, what this means 2 years, 3 years from now. I think ultimately this is not going to end well for the actual people of Russia, and it's not going to end well for the people of Europe as well." For these comments, which just urge humanity and restraint, Congresswoman Omar has been called every nasty name you can imagine in the book. On Twitter, she was sent pictures of dead Ukrainian children with the implication that their deaths were somehow on her hands. She was, of course, accused of being a Russian puppet, and she was even smeared as being an anti-white racist. These sort of attacks, though, they might be familiar to Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She was the sole member of Congress to vote against giving George W. Bush the blank check for war that he wanted, and that ultimately led us to decades of disaster and moral atrocities. Congresswoman Lee received so many death threats at the time for her stance that she was assigned a personal security detail. She was called a traitor who hated America. People sent her letters proclaiming their desire that she had been among the dead in the Twin Towers. And take a look at this. Even the supposedly respectable Wall Street Journal said she was, quote, "a long-practicing supporter of America's enemies." But of course, now with distance from the madness and frenzy of the time, she was 100% correct. Vindicated. Congresswoman Lee herself pointed at the time to the example of 2 other courageous senators who had been the only votes against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which of course authorized LBJ to, quote, "take all necessary measures in Vietnam." You might also think of the example in recent times set by Russ Feingold. He was the only U.S. senator to vote against the Patriot Act during that frenzy. Lone voices, despised at the time, whose wisdom we would have done really well to heed. So as we lurch into more and more extreme actions, casually embracing measures which were previously unthinkable just weeks ago, please listen to those people like Congresswoman Omar who are trying desperately to stand outside of the mania, and hold on in your mind to the wise words of Barbara Lee. She said, "Let's step back for a moment. Let's just pause just for a minute and think through the implications of our actions today so that this does not spiral out of control." And listen, Doesn't mean that when you have the unpopular opinion, you're always correct. But we have seen repeated examples. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.